in here, about 1.5 litres a minute, passes it into this machine, which has got a little cell in it that shines a laser through the airstream. And every time a dust particle disrupts the laser beam, that's a count. And so it counts particles as it's going past in this airstream. So I had a pair of these, one downwind, so on the eastern side of a cultivated paddock. It had a weed problem, it was being managed by cultivation, and a controlled traffic no-till paddock just across the road. So I had these two running, ran that over 4.5 months, which is a lot of data. It broke our version of Excel. Had a weather station there to tell us which direction it was coming in from, because I really wanted to concentrate on the wind coming from the west, because I knew then the dust was probably coming off these paddocks or upwind of that. Now that's a pretty busy slide, but first of all, looking at the yellow, that's the airspeed as measured off on this side. So up here, this little sort of burst of wind is at a bit over 40 k's an hour average, and that lasted for about 8 hours in time. Then you've got the blue and the purple traces. The blue trace is the bare earth tillage paddock, tillage control of weeds, and the purple one is that stubble retain system. So there's two things. As soon as I looked at the data set, I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense. The high wind's here, and then some hours later, we get the same shaped kind of plume of dust coming through. What on earth's that about? And the EPA guy said two things. One, these are 5-minute averages. He said, if that's smoothish, that dust came from a long way away. You imagine someone's down the other end of the paddock with a big bucket of dirt and just throwing a handful up every 5 seconds, then my monitor would have these spikes going like this. But if you are 10 k's up the road and creating a vast amount of dust in the air, it would be quite a smooth curve. And so what this says is not only did it come from a way away, but when you work out the average airspeed and the time delay from when the wind picked up until the dust picked up, you can work out how far away it came from. That's South Australian dust, free fertiliser for Victoria, from erosion happening 200 to 300 k's away. So that's fine. That's got nothing to do with my cropping system here. That's come from elsewhere. What's coming from my system? If you see here, we've got this really up and down airspeed. It's gone from 45 down to 25 and back to 50, gusty conditions. And so what's happened is you've got spikes at the very same time, you've got spikes in these readings here. And you'll see that the tillage paddock, the bare earth with no protection for the soil, the peaks are always higher. So there's your local soil protection. We've got far less dust load coming off the protected stubble retain system, and you've got a much higher dust coming off that. It surprised me this whole signal was dominated from South Australian soil, but what did I take out of this? You're losing less of your own soil by having your stubble standing, and you're gaining someone else's. What's happened is, this gain here, it's about 25–30% of the dust that came in on the western edge of the paddock is actually trapped in the stubble in the paddock. So you are actually trapping that nutrient coming in from the west. And again, the part of the soil that really blows long distance is generally the clay fraction, the very lightest part, which is also good at complexing those nutrients. It's got cation exchange capacity. So in the main, you're getting a fairly good source of nutrients coming in. So that's a good news story. Keep your stubble standing, keep your own soil where it should be, and take someone else's if they're giving it away.
So Chris,
yeah,
that was about at 1 metre high, was it? Yeah, the catching, the dust catching.
The height of the air intake.
Yeah.
I had the intake at 1,500 mil, so 5 foot. 5 foot. I had to arm wrestle the EPA guy. He wanted it on a 10-metre mast, right, and I wanted it as close to the ground as possible.
That's what I was thinking. If your later stuff might be lower or something.
Exactly. And if we did it again, I would have had it mounted on the ground with the intake at about sort of 300 mil off the ground. But EPA's worried about human health, and I'm worried about the system, and so we had to compromise. But yeah. And where does all that dust go if we don't catch it? Well, this was the September 09 thing, and this dust band that went out into the ocean, also into Sydney Harbour, University of Sydney worked it out, and they reckon that 3 million tonnes of topsoil ended up out in the Tasman. A fair bit of it ended up in waterways like in Sydney Harbour, and they measured the the chlorophyll in the algae, the algal bloom and effect that happened in Sydney Harbour because of that. So that's where a lot of this goes. Certainly wasted to us, and they worked out 30,000 tonnes of nutrients such as nitrate and phosphate all disappeared out to the sea from this sort of stuff. So, but yes, it also ends up in stubbles like that. So I think that's a pretty strong argument for keeping a stubble standing. And if you see a South Australian today, thank them, because they're being very generous. Now I guess I've talked a bit about the survey that we do. These are some of the results we got at the end of this summer as to how much of the soils were cultivated during summer, bare earth, at higher risk during the summer period. Yes, it was wet, so wind erosion probably wasn't the biggest issue, but what we wanted to do from our perspective is we're interested in the practice change, the getting the messages out to guys to consider in their farming system how they can best look after their soil, which is, after all, the productive asset that supports. If you can grow healthy roots with good nutrients, then you should get away with a good business. And so what we saw was, on average across this whole transect path, we saw just under 15% of paddocks were cultivated bare earth during summer, but by no means was even across the landscape. And so Sheep Hills in that area wins the prize for the lowest. And you've got an area through the middle here which is quite high. But again, if you look at if we want to be really targeted about what we do, we look at the high wind erosion risk soil with the high management risk on top of it. And so that area there is an area that we probably see as a primary focus to go and do some more work with groups up there and stories in the paper and do what we can to make people aware of, I guess, the risks that they're putting their assets at. The other thing you'll notice, without getting too personal, is that there are clusters of paddocks, and that probably means that 2, 3, 4 of those paddocks could probably have a changed management system by having a good discussion with one person. Not that we're doing a Big Brother thing. This is all about saying, all right, well, in that northern part of the Wimmera there, perhaps we can run some more information sessions and workshops and see what we can do. You see down here, between Dimboola and Nil, it's red hot for a bit of bare earth, but it's also some of the safer soils. But again, overall, the best picture would be everyone's lower. So there are all sorts of targets we can use to evaluate how we're trying to address these risks in the landscape and work through the system. So we're pretty pleased with how that's going. It should make us more prepared to go and address some of the higher risk areas. Now, I guess the other thing about this last summer, of course, was the prodigious amount of water we had in the landscape. And as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about stubbles as wind erosion protection, but I think it's kind of stood stead fairly well, keeping our soils where we needed them. Now, this is there's a fair bit of power in the rainfall we had. This is up in the Rainbow Jeparit area. I'd say under Tim Fisher's system of gold, silver and bronze, that's rust in terms of the state of our railway. That particular railway line is about 10 foot above the surrounding ground level. And you can see the stubble wrapped up around it. This is downstream from a couple of sites I'll show you pictures of, but in that area with 160 mil in a day, you're talking the average size paddock that we look at of 50 hectares having 80 megalitres of water come off it that day. So prodigious amounts of water. There's a tree that was growing in this embankment here that's nearly a kilometre out on the plain there, just from the power that pushed it out there. So you wouldn't change your whole cropping system because of a 1 in 200 year event, but it's worth knowing what your system is capable of protecting you from. Call it insurance. So this is part of the catchment above that railway, and it's a very delicate soil, very lightly structured, beautiful standing stubble, very thick, and that stubble's hung on for grim death. It's actually done some pretty good protection as far as keeping the soil where it needs to be. So that is best practice management of a high risk soil for wind erosion, essentially, but it's done this landholder some pretty good service in terms of keeping that soil where it should be. This is another example on the same paddock there. So I think again you need to think about some of this as also